Be the Talk, episode 373, featuring Jonathan Marks. Welcome to Be the Talk. We go behind the talk 7 days a week for tips and techniques to help you change the world. I'm Nathan Eckel, and a talker myself. I'm interviewing others who change the world with their talk. You can too, even if you've never given a talk before. Let's get started with today's show. We are live with Jonathan Marks. Jonathan, are you ready to talk?
I am indeed.
Jonathan H. Marks is director of the bioethics program at Penn State University and affiliate faculty at Penn State Law and International Affairs. He is also a barrister and academic member of Matrix Chambers, London, and Geneva. Jonathan Marks, welcome to the talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your recent talk, which was actually started as a TEDx and then it got picked up by TED, it's called In Praise of Conflict, and you make a distinguish between the common good versus common ground. And your main point seems to be that organizations and government and other watchdog entities are becoming more about the common ground than the common good. They're shirking their duty in some cases, my interpretation as watchdogs. And I love the talk because it really underplays some of the overplaying that we've seen in recent years of collaboration. I'm all for collaboration, but there are times and places where it is important to have conflict. So please, Jonathan, take us behind the talk.
Absolutely. So, what I really want to challenge in the talk is this sort of unthinking assumption we have that conflict is inherently bad and that compromise is inherently good. And as I argue, that's too simplistic. The ethics of conflict depend on who's fighting, how they're fighting, and why they're fighting. And compromise, well, if you and I come to an agreement and it benefits each of us and nobody else is hurt or harmed, that's totally fine. So me and a colleague providing feedback on each other's draft articles within 24 hours, that's an unproblematic reciprocity. You doing the washing up, your partner cooking dinner, that's also fine. But reciprocity and compromise between us when it's potentially harmful to someone else, especially someone that one of us has an obligation to protect, that's deeply problematic.
So the game changer is when you are a protector, when you are you're basically a custodian for the public good or some kind of other, and you're shirking that. You're subject to being, I'm trying to think of a better, nicer word than bribed or bought off or compromised or something like that. But what I love about your talk is it really brings this back out into the forefront. Certainly, if we had in the sports arena, we don't want to have anything other than honest conflict, or else we call that taking a dive. And I think it's just a really good way of reminding ourselves the power of conflict and competition to produce good as long as the rules aren't rigged.
So, what I really worry about is influence, the influence especially of government agencies. And we have totally recognized the importance of conflict in other spheres. So, for example, one famous constitutional scholar describes the U.S. Constitution as an invitation to struggle addressed to the branches of government. So, Obamacare, for example, was plagued by a decade of litigation. But we don't think it would be a good idea, I hope, for the next White House, whoever that may be, and congressional leaders to sit down with the Supreme Court and draft new legislation. Now, of course, if they all sat together, congressional leaders would have the advantage of knowing which provisions were likely to withstand constitutional challenge. It would save a decade's worth of uncertainty and doubt. But we don't think that's a good idea because when the Supreme Court gets into bed with the other branches of government, it can't do the two things it's designed to do. It's designed to hold the other branches of government accountable, and it's designed to determine the constitutionality of laws. And it can't do either of those, and certainly can't do them with any credibility when it's making the laws and climbing into bed with the other branches of government. So we get the importance of conflict and struggle as between the branches of government. And I want to also add, we get it in the private sphere too. If two airlines were to get together, one would say, "I'll take the route from DC to New York," and the second one says, "Great, and I'll take the route from Boston to New York," or they agree to fix the prices for one of those routes. We, the public, are harmed. We end up paying more. So we get the need for corporations also to be in tension, in struggle with each other, competing, not colluding, as antitrust law calls it. So given the need for this tension and struggle and conflict as between public and private, how do we get to the place where we think we can solve our most pressing or wicked problems, the opioid crisis, the obesity epidemic, cancer, climate change, by partnering with public and private? I argue no, we need just the same struggle, tension, and conflict between public and private.
Well, this is all in the book, correct? Which was just released. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? We get more than the 15-minute talk in the book.
No, absolutely. And I'm very grateful for the additional time. So yes, this is the book out from Oxford just in the last few weeks, called In Perils of Partnership. And my subtitle, I sort of wish I'd given it a question or a statement, something punchier, but the subtitle is Industry Influence, Institutional Integrity, and Public Health. And in the book, I sort of explore this theme in relation to public health with a focus on the food and soda industries. And I do touch on opioids, and then, in fact, develop the theme in relation to opioids in a piece in The Conversation in the last couple of weeks, which was also picked up by Salon and others. But essentially, my argument is this: building on the claim I made about the need for separation, tension, and conflict, I say that's the same thing we need between public health agencies and food and soda companies. And that is not the paradigm in public health right now. The paradigm in public health is to invite corporations, food and soda companies, often the companies that are creating or exacerbating the very problems that public health agencies are trying to solve. The paradigm is to invite them to sit around the table and to say, hey guys, you should be part of the solution, not just part of the problem.
Well, the example that you have in your talk is from India, developing country, obviously, and not the same system of checks and balances as we have here in the United States. I've been to India. I can appreciate some of the one-sidedness of that example, and it's a pretty egregious example. There are all kinds of other examples here in the United States that you go into, such as the fracking and the people that build their dream home right on the mountaintop, where the rights have already been sold, and then they basically get compensated, I'll say it that way, into silence to move somewhere else and hopefully build a nicer and bigger home somewhere else that don't have the land rights taken away from them. What other examples do you have in your book, or what else would you like to say as we wrap up this portion about that?
So, I have a lot of examples, but I just want to bring them back to the framing that you began with between the common good and common ground. And that's just to say, if you have a partnership between a company with a vested commercial interest, whether it be a soda company with a vested interest in how government agencies address obesity, whether it be an opioid company with a vested interest in how we deal with the problem of opioid addiction and abuse, when you partner with them, you get, well, first of all, the problem gets framed in a way that best promotes and protects the interests of the corporate actor. So you end up putting off the table the kinds of intervention that might promote the public good or the common good, but will be threatening to the interests of that company. So common ground in that case is totally inconsistent with the public good or the common good.
Well, so it's a collaboration. You're bringing the enemy, and we're still mostly capitalistic society here, but this is a conflict of interests, and you're letting the people with the other side frame the debate and choose the languaging and soften and really compromise the issue.
Absolutely. But I do want to add that, I don't hold the sort of Manichaean view that government is inherently good and that corporations are inherently evil. Each is capable of good or ill, as current times remind us. But what's important is that we've created corporations to make a profit and create a return for their shareholders by selling goods and services. And that's not the function of governments and public health agencies in particular. They have to protect the public good and public health in particular when it comes to a public health agency. Now, people get that to some extent when you're talking about tobacco, for example. They're a little less sure when it comes to food. And then when it comes to drugs, they say, but hold on, aren't drug companies trying to do the very same thing? Aren't they trying to help people? And I would argue that that's how we've got into this current mess with the opioid crisis.
Well, we've been enjoying this conversation with Jonathan Marks. His talk is called In Praise of Conflict. There's a book just released by Oxford University Press by the same name that is very big right now. And in just a moment, we're going to be right back with Jonathan Marks in the Blitz Round. And it's time for the Blitz Round with Jonathan Marks. Jonathan, are you ready?
I am indeed. And just to say that the book is a slightly different title from the TED Talk. It's The Perils of Partnership. The
Perils of Partnership. I missed that, and thank you very much for the correction. All right. I'm going to ask Jonathan a series of either-or questions related to the preparation and performance of his talk. So first question, were you invited or did you apply?
I was nominated by a colleague.
Are you a memorizer, improviser, or blender?
I am principally an improviser, although I would say that I keep in my head some general principles.
And what's a tip, tool, or technique that you would suggest?
Oh, I think I have a few. The first big one I would say is that a TED Talk requires a level of preparation and time which I had not fully anticipated. It's much easier to talk for 45 minutes or an hour than it is for 14 or 15.
Absolutely. Well, what was the most painful part of your talk to cut out? This is the cut for time question, as you just mentioned.
So I would say that initially I find cutting everything hard, especially with my articles. But I make it easier for myself because I create a little side document called Offcuts, and I put any idea there. So I've developed this technique of making cutting less painful than it otherwise would be.
And that's a great tip because as you are, you got to kind of slice off these little darlings, these little babies, and it makes for great social media text. It makes for great blog posts and articles and other things like that. Were you able to harvest some of those secondary thoughts for good use, Jonathan?
Well, they ended up in the book, so they didn't go at it. So I had the luxury of turning a 50-minute TED Talk into a book. But I think it's a great discipline to be able to focus on what your central message is. And actually, I do this with my students in class. They were working on their research papers at the time I was giving the TED Talk, and I said, "Okay, imagine you're confined to an 8 or 10 word title at most. What would that be?" And that really helped them focus on what their central concern was and what their central claim is. So I think it's a helpful discipline.
It is a great discipline. Here's my last question. What was the most unexpected, strange, or just plain weird thing that happened during or before your talk?
The most unexpected thing that happened during my talk, I think, was to get so excited and carried away that I've forgotten entirely where I was in my slides. So that's what I would advise people to do, is to pay attention to that. But it was a terrific experience.
Well, we've been enjoying this Blitz Round with Jonathan Marks. You can find out more at his website, jonathanhmarks.org, jonathanhmarks.org. And you can go to /book to find more out about his book. And we'll be right back with Jonathan Marks in just a moment with the final word of advice. And we're back with Jonathan Marks. What's the final word of advice for Talk Universe?
So if you mean in relation to the subject matter of the book and the talk, it's that we should really call on our public officials and policymakers to ensure that they are protecting our interests, whether it's the FAA regulating airlines and the Boeing 737 MAX 8, about which we're hearing a great deal now, whether it's public health agencies trying to promote our health and well-being. Whatever it is, we should insist that they're acting to protect and promote the public good and public health, and not to be acting as unwitting promoters or witting promoters of the interests of powerful commercial actors.
Jonathan Marks, thank you so much for coming on the Talk today and sharing your wisdom with Talk Universe.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Be the Talk. For tips and resources to help you change the world, go to BeTheTalk.com. See you tomorrow.